It's my pleasure to introduce my friend, Attorney General Eric Holder.
There's a substantial amount of our structure that needs to be repaired, that needs to be examined. And I think we should, what I've tried to point out in the book is that we have faced these issues before, and that we've had heroes and heroines in our history that have faced similar kinds of issues, and through sacrifice, commitment, they have made a difference. And we have the capacity, I think, to make these kinds of changes.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Capehart podcast on Washington Post Live. I am Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at the Washington Post. The United States is at a critical pivot point, so critical that my guest today writes, American democracy is on the brink of collapse. The name of the book is Our Unfinished March, The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote. Its author was the 82nd Attorney General of the United States under President Obama, the first African-American appointed as the nation's top law enforcement official. He is Eric Holder. Attorney General Holder, welcome back to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
Mr. Capehart, it is a pleasure to see you as always. How you doing?
I am well, thanks. I am well. So listen, we got to talk about some things before we talk about the book. As America's former chief law enforcement official, what do you make of the recent string of mass shootings and attempts in Congress to pass some type of gun safety legislation?
Well, unfortunately, what we're seeing now in the nation with regard to mass shootings is not something that is unique to this year. We have been seeing this for decades at this point. If you look back to, those awful shootings almost a decade ago or at this point at Newtown, at Sandy Hook Elementary School. We have seen time after time after time. It's hard to keep in our own minds, where did the shooting occur? How many people died? It is time. It is beyond time for the leaders of this nation, for Congress, for our state legislatures to act and to put into place reasonable gun safety measures to stop this. We are the only nation, the only comparable nation that has these rates of mass shootings, these rates of gun killings. There are people talk about mental health. There are people with mental issues in other nations, in Europe, Asia, other parts of the world, who don't have anything close to the gun death rate of violence that we see in this nation. It is the presence of guns and the way in which we allow people to get them and to use them that is at the root of our problem. And so Congress needs to act. Congress needs to finally act. And if they don't act, people need to hold them accountable.
Well, I was about to ask, what does it say about our political system that even after the slaughter of children at Newtown, at Parkland, at Uvalde, that not even the most minimal thing related to gun safety can get passed?
Well, it means that at least one party, the Republican Party, has welded itself to the gun industry, the gun lobby, and that has to be broken. And that's a function of one of the things I talk about in the book, this whole notion of gerrymandering, where politicians get to pick their voters. And this is a really graphic example of the harm, the concrete harm of gerrymandering, where a politician can do something inconsistent with the desires of his or her constituents and not suffer any political consequence because they are in these gerrymandered, safe districts. It's one of the structural changes that we need to make so that we have a government that is responsive to the needs and the desires of the people. You got to remember, 90% of the people in this country are in favor of background checks and have been so since the shootings at Sandy Hook. And yet we have done nothing. 60% of the people are in favor of banning the possession and the use of AR-15s, these assault rifles, and yet we do nothing. We have got to hold our politicians accountable, but we also have to change our systems so that we actually can hold our politicians responsible.
I was going to come to gerrymandering a little bit later, so since you brought it up, let's go there. The idea of elected officials picking their voters as opposed to voters picking their elected officials. This is something that both parties do. This is not just one party, it's both parties. So how did we get to this point where elected officials are choosing their voters?
Yeah, and we've, as I say in the book, we've been dealing with the problem of gerrymandering since the beginning of the Republic. The founding fathers, James Madison, James Monroe, got into a dispute. Patrick Henry actually, I don't remember who, he actually drew a gerrymander so that one of the Jameses could not serve in the House of Representatives. So we've been dealing with it for that long. Princeton University did a study that said that the gerrymandering of 2011, where Republicans really went to town, was the worst of the past half century. But it is true. The Democrats have also gerrymandered. The difference that we have now, and we saw in 2011 and that we see in 2021, 2022, is that we now have scientific capabilities, computer capabilities, forensic capabilities, not only to know kind of how neighborhoods are going to vote, but also to figure out how households are going to vote. And so the lines can be drawn with surgical precision to maximize the impact of a gerrymander, to maximize the safeness of a seat for a particular party. So you have a desire on the parts of parties to do these kinds of things. I would say disproportionately Republicans now, and they have the tools They have the tools to make these gerrymanders not only effective, but to make them enduring.
Right, make them enduring and also make them impervious to the will of the people. And this gets to minority rule, which you write about in the book, and the inability of Congress to enact legislation supported by a majority of the public reflects this troubling disconnect where legislators representing a minority of interests have disproportionate power to halt legislation. We have seen it time and again when it comes to gun safety legislation. And as I said, you write about this in your book. Talk about what can only be called minority rule.
Yeah, we are in danger of slipping into what I would call a political apartheid system, where a minority of the people in this country will have disproportionate amounts of power and be able to put in place things that are not supported by the majority. Again, let's get concrete about this. It appears that the Supreme Court is about to overrule the Roe versus Wade decision, something that in every state, if you go state by state, even in the most conservative of states, people are against. Now, the margins are different in New York as opposed to, say, Texas or Oklahoma. And yet, the minority will be represented by the majority that was put on the Supreme Court by two presidents who did not win the majority of the vote because of our electoral college, will have the ability to foist on the nation a policy with regard to reproductive rights that is not supported by the people of this country. And you see it in a whole range of other issues. Gun safety, we talked about that. Criminal justice reform, a whole range of things that where the American people are essentially together, 60% in some instances, 80, 90%, as I said, with regard to background checks. And yet we don't see our laws, our regulations, our policies reflective of what in a lot of places is consensus on the part of the American people. Yeah, we are a divided nation right now, but we are a lot more together than people, I think, recognize. And we could be a lot more together if we had a political system that reflected the will of the majority.
Let's keep talking about the Supreme Court, because when you were Attorney General, the Supreme Court struck down many of the provisions of the 1965 Voting Rights Act in a case that bears your name, Shelby v. Holder. Why was that ruling so damaging to the right to vote?
Yeah, without getting too technical, what the ruling essentially did was take the Justice Department out of the role that the 1965 Voting Rights Act created for it, and that was to allow the Justice Department to look at changes that were going to be made with regard to, say, polling places, voting times, how precinct lines were drawn in those jurisdictions that were covered, within covered jurisdictions that largely reflected the states of the old Confederacy, but also parts of New York State. People don't necessarily understand that, and took that Justice Department power away, which allowed the states then, and almost immediately after the ruling, to put into place a whole range of things that suppressed the vote, made it more difficult for people to vote, put purges in place of certain people, all of which would have been objected to by the Justice Department. But the Justice Department was no longer on the field. And we have seen since the Shelby County ruling, just one statistic, almost 1,800 polling places around the country that have closed. We have seen the imposition of these unnecessary photo ID laws to prove that you are, in fact, who you claim to be when you go to the polling places. When the Brennan Center says that the likelihood that a person's going to go to a polling place and try to cast a fraudulent in-person ballot is less likely than you're going to get hit by lightning. I mean, you're more likely to get hit by lightning than to try to cast an in-person fraudulent ballot. And so a whole range of things were put in place that the Justice Department could not object to.
Were you surprised by how quickly states moved to take advantage of the Shelby v. Holder ruling?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Yeah, I was surprised. I didn't think first the court would do what it did, given the fact that the Voting Rights Act had recently been reauthorized, signed by a Republican president, passed unanimously in the Senate, small opposition in the House of Representatives, I mean like 20, 30 people. So the fact that it happened surprised me. And then I expected, that the states would take advantage of it. But I thought it might be months down the road. And in fact, it was weeks and days before states started to take advantage of the ruling and to change the provisions or a variety of electoral things that they knew would have been prohibited prior to the gutting of the act by the Supreme Court. Then Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott, I think on the day of the ruling, sent out a tweet that said to the effect, well, this means Eric Holder and the Justice Department no longer can interfere with Texas politics, something along those lines. But this was on the same day as the ruling. And we have seen, as I said, since 2013, which was the date of the ruling, a whole range of things done by Republican legislatures, governors, to put in place either unnecessary or really counterproductive measures to have an impact on voters who they perceive to be Democrats and voters who are disproportionately people of color.
Let me restate to you a quote of yours from the book that I mentioned in the intro, and that is, American democracy is on the brink of collapse. You've touched on a lot of the reasons why in various responses to my questions. But what struck me about reading that and knowing you for as long as I have, because you're not prone to hyperbole, you're not prone to drama. But that is a very dramatic statement. Do you feel that are we on the brink of collapse, or are we scrambling as we slide down the hill?
Well, I'd say that we're dangerously close to collapse. I mean, I'm not a hyperbolic person. I don't say things that are, I think, without basis in fact. And I'm really concerned. Our democracy is certainly under attack. In addition to all the things that I've talked about with regard to unfair voting procedures, we have seen attacks on our electoral infrastructure. I mean, who actually counts the votes? We've seen, this notion of this doctrine of independent state legislatures, where a legislature might actually decide, based on, I guess, what a legislature wants to consider, anything other than the popular vote, to decide who actually goes to the electoral college to cast votes for president. There's a whole range of things that are happening now that give me great great pause about the state of our democracy. But I think what I hope people get from the book is that we have faced similar kinds of issues in the past, although this one is about as serious as they come. And because people have, bound themselves together, committed themselves, sacrificed, we have gotten through it, and we have that capacity now, I think, to save our democracy. And I think we should understand something here, and I'm not being hyperbolic here either. If you look at Europe in the 20th century, democracies fell there, not because fascism was strong, but because the defense of democracy was weak. And we should learn from that. There was a coup attempt on January the 6th to stop the peaceful transfer of power, to stop the transfer of power at all. I suspect we're going to see things from the January 6th committee over the course, starting, I guess, next week, that I think is going to really be shocking. And I hope people will pay attention. I hope people will be moved by what they see. And I hope that will goad us into the necessary structural changes that I think we have to make in order to preserve the American experiment.
Well, let's keep talking about January 6th, because the first hearing is set for June 9th in prime time. And I'm wondering, what are you hoping comes out of these hearings? And do you think these hearings will actually make a difference?
With regard to the second question, will it make a difference? I don't know. I think my concern is that people are so entrenched in their positions that some conservatives, Republicans will look and say, "Oh, this is all fake news. It's not real. It's inconsistent with what Donald Trump says." Hopefully, Democrats, liberals, progressives will be moved. And my hope is that those people who are, independent, and there's a substantial number of those folks, will look at this with, in a neutral way and be convinced or not convinced by what it is that the committee says. But what I think we're going to see is a conspiracy, the breadth and depth of which is going to be truly shocking. We have seen leaks from the committee that give you a sense of what's to come. There's been great journalism done by people at the Post and other outlets that give us more of a sense of what we are likely to see. And even what we know so far, I think, is quite frightening to see that you had people at the highest levels of the White House engage with people at the Justice Department, aided by lawyers coming up with cockamamie theories, all designed to not have that electoral vote count happen on January the 6th, throw the election into the House of Representatives after you disqualified 3 or 4 states' electors, and allow Donald Trump to continue in office, even though he lost the election by 7 million votes. My hope is that people will be shocked by that, alarmed by that, and demand that changes be made and that people be held accountable. Because if no one is held accountable, there is no deterrent effect, and it doesn't stop somebody 20, 30, 40 years from now from trying to do the same thing that the Trump crowd tried to do before and after January the 6th.
Now, Mr. Former Attorney General, that there are a lot of people who are afraid that a lot of people involved in January 6th will not be held accountable, and they've been focusing a lot of their ire at one of your successors, the current Attorney General, Attorney General Merrick Garland. There are people who are concerned that he is moving way too slowly, if they don't think he's moving at all. How concerned are you that the Attorney General isn't taking this as seriously as a lot of the American people are? And are you concerned that the Department of Justice won't hold anyone accountable?
No, I'm not really concerned about that. I've known Merrick for a fair number of years. He is a serious, sober person who has a great record both as a judge and when he was a prosecutor. There's a great Deputy Attorney General, Lisa Monaco, a great Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta. I'm confident the leadership of the Justice Department will do the right thing. The fact that the Justice Department does not speak or have the ability to share what it's actually doing is consistent with the way we have structured things. The Justice Department speaks through indictments. I think it is, however, significant if you look at the speech that the Attorney General gave. I think it was on January the 5th, maybe January the 6th. He said that the Justice Department would hold accountable people who were engaged in the January 6th activities at any level. Those three words, at any level. And he is a person who is careful with his words. As I said, he's a former judge. And I think that was telegraphing something in a very significant way. So I think ultimately the Justice Department will do, from my perspective, something that's consistent with the facts, consistent with the law. And I think we'll have a good sense of what those facts are as we have the January 6th committee share its findings.
Let me bring you back to the book, because you write about, and you've mentioned the heroes and heroines throughout our history in terms of securing the right, fighting for the right to vote, securing the right to vote. Among all of them, who is for you the greatest hero?
Boy, that's a tough one. That's a really tough one. The book is dedicated to John Lewis, a person who, as I say in the book, he called me his friend. I could never get to that place with him. He was my idol, a person who I just totally respected and had a good relationship with. His pivotal role in marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, getting his skull cracked, being an instrumental part of getting the 1965 Voting Rights Act put into place. He is a person who, for me, is a seminal figure. And yet, I think, one of the things that people need to understand, this fight for voting rights is something that a lot of groups have gone through. You think about this guy, Thomas Dorr, in 1840 in Rhode Island, who was fighting for the right of white men without property to get the right to vote. And he fomented a rebellion in Rhode Island. I'm not saying we should do that. I think about Alice Paul, a young woman who marched with other women down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1913, and not were booed or anything like that. They were actually beaten as they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, demanding the right to vote for women. She then, in 1917, as she camped out in front of the White House, was arrested, put in the D.C. jail, and a tube was put down her nose, and she was force-fed along with her fellow protesters in what was called the Night of Horror. And that so moved Woodrow Wilson, who had his own problems, to ultimately come out for the right to vote for women. And then just briefly, a couple of people in the present day. A young woman named Love Caesar, who saw that the campus of North Carolina A&T, which is the largest historically black college university in the country, was gerrymandered. And she took a piece of chalk and just drew a line right down the middle of the campus to show where that line was drawn, to raise the consciousness of the kids there. And she raised it to our attention, and through her activism, our lawsuit, we were able to change, actually able to change the lines and make them more fair in the whole state of North Carolina. So there are people in the past, there are people in the present. So I've not totally answered your question in the sense that I picked one, but those are among the people who I mentioned in the book. And I try to tell the story through various people, through various times in our history, about the fight for voting rights, and to make people understand that this is not simply about the desire of African Americans to get the right to vote, though we play a central role. It is about the desire of all Americans to have the ability to cast a ballot.
Right. I want to read back to you another quote in your book, especially for those who have not had a chance to read it yet. You write, "In the long run, the story of American democracy is one of grinding, halting, blood-stained persistence and expansion, even in the face of tyranny. But we've had to work for it, because the path to progress has never been blazed through inertia." And I wanted to read that quote because what do you say to folks, particularly young folks, who see the inertia in Washington on voting rights, on gun police reform, on gun safety, you name it, as a reason to sit out defending democracy with their votes?
Yeah, inertia gets us nothing. The lack of action by our political leaders should not lead to pessimism, which also leads to inaction. We have got to be optimistic about the ability for us to be masters again of our own fate, and that is only through action. I mean, I'm sure there are times when Alice Paul, who I talked about, in the fight for women's suffrage, probably thought this is not going to happen, and yet she fought through that. I'm sure that Dr. King, John Lewis, Andrew Young, at some point, on a bad evening thought, are we really going to be able to rip down a system of American racial apartheid? And yet they fought through that. We have hundreds of Americans, thousands, millions of Americans who fought for an America that they never experienced, that they could only imagine. And that's that's the kind of spirit I think we have to have today. If we can't envision in our own minds the America that we want to have exist, we will not get to that place. And so I understand. And people could say, Eric, your list is too long. You're being wildly optimistic. You're not being realistic. Those people who brought about change in this country had lists that were long, were wildly optimistic, were charged with being unrealistic. So I line myself up with them. And I think if we fight, if we're prepared to sacrifice, if we're prepared to commit ourselves to the cause, we can change this country for the better. We can actually save this country in a way that I think that's a debt that we owe to people who gave so much so that we would be the nation that we are today.
Let me get you on one more thing. This is a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center that came out last week. And I just wrote a column about it. I talked about it on the show yesterday. It's so disturbing because let me just read you this key data point. Nearly 7 in 10 Republicans believe some aspects of the racist Great Replacement conspiracy, that that people of color, non-whites, and immigrants are purposefully being brought into the country to replace white voters. But here's 7 in 10 Republicans is already disturbing. But here's another data point. Overall, 48% of Americans agreed that demographic changes in the United States were part of a, quote, purposeful plan to replace white voters. Would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I gave a speech that I got a lot of grief about back in 2009, a Black History Month speech.
Remember that.
And among other things, I said that, we have never come to grips with our racial past, our racial present, or our racial future. And until we do, we will not become the nation that I think we can become. And in that speech, I warned that people not committed to the American ideals would take advantage of the fear that we have, that Americans have around race and ethnicity, and use it for their own political purposes. We need to understand our history. We need to understand our present. We need to understand the changing demography that this nation is fated to have. And as I said back in 2009, that changing demography can be something that is a plus for this nation if we accept it, if we understand it, or it can be something that divides this nation if it is exploited in inappropriate ways. The fact that we are a changing nation, we've always been a changing nation, and that gives us a competitive advantage over more homogenous nations as we are competing around the world. The things that people are saying now about this new wave of immigration that we're dealing with, but the same things that people said about waves of immigrants that came at the beginning of the 20th century, when Italians, when people from Ireland were seen as changing, the fabric of the nation. So this is not something that is necessarily new. We've dealt with this before, and that's why our study and our understanding of our history is really the foundation for the better future that I still think that we can have.
You write in the book, and we've discussed it, America is on the brink of collapse. Your gut right now, can we get through this? Will we save America from collapse, our democracy from collapse?
Yeah, I think we'll get through it, and I think that we'll come out of this stronger. But it's not going to be something that happens in a 24-hour news cycle. It's not going to be something that happens over the course of a week. It's going to take, it's going to take some time, and it's going to take the involvement of a whole bunch of people, as it always has. The civil rights movement was not successful in a year. The fight for women's suffrage did not occur over the course of a few months. It's going to take some time, but I'm really confident that we are starting to see here the attempt at a birth of a new era of civic engagement by the American people. And the status quo, people in the status quo, those who have power now, are afraid of that, and they're trying to keep that civic engagement, the involvement of the American people, trying to minimize that. And so we've got to fight through that. We've got to fight those people who want to hold on to power at all costs, and try to empower the people of this country. I'm actually optimistic that we'll do this. It won't be easy. There will be sacrifices. It'll come in zigs and zags. There'll be progress, and then we won't see progress. There'll be failures, but I think overall that arc that Dr. King talked about is one that, if not inevitable, is likely to happen if we're willing to fight for it.
Eric Holder, 82nd Attorney General of the United States and author, along with Sam Koppelman, author of the book Our Unfinished March: The Violent Past and Imperiled Future of the Vote. Attorney General Holder, thank you so much for coming back to Capehart on Washington Post Live.
All right. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
All right. And thank you for joining us. To check out what interviews we have coming up, head to WashingtonPostLive.com. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at The Washington Post. Thanks for watching Capehart on Washington Post Live.